lesson number 4. We're looking at Psalms to kind of guide us in prayer, to give us some possible directions that we can take our prayer and maybe we haven't thought about. And we'll start with a prayer. Dear God, we come to you now in worship. We praise you in righteousness and your mercy. We understand that you are all powerful, filled with honor and glory. Please guide us as we study your word to find the meat that will lead us to praise you and to thank you as we should. Guide our hearts in this study to focus especially on prayer and how improving our prayer can lead us to follow you more closely. In Jesus' name we pray. I think you got through Psalms 5, verse 7 last time, so we'll start at 8, go through 12. I've got it on your sheet there, but feel free to open your Bibles too. I'll read that, and then we'll go through each verse one by one and see what we come up with. It says, "Lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thine way straight before my face. For there is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. Destroy thou them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee. But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee. For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield." We'll just go through each one of these. Again, I just gave you a sheet of paper, mostly blank, so you can write down whatever you think. And I appreciate anything you do to join, to recognize what you see also, because I'm sure I'm not seeing everything in these verses that I should recognize as something that's prayer worthy. So the first verse we're going to look at is Psalms 5:8. It says, "Lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thy way straight before my face." So what can we see in this verse? Anybody have anything that they see that speaks to them about something that we should be praying for or recognizing?
First word, lead, to me points out that we need to acknowledge God Almighty is in control, and we follow His lead. Not the world and everything that's around us distracting. Follow Him, let Him lead us. I think that's one of the things we talk about is in thy righteousness. That's the only righteousness there is.
Right.
I think that ties together. We should follow Him.
Yeah. That's a good one, I think, lead. I think about it and say, so why do we need to ask God to lead us? That doesn't, if we're doing what we're supposed to, He's going to lead us. So, but He's asking, He's saying, lead me. Not just, like you said, it's not just something that we're doing on our own. God's helping us in some way. So I think that's something to focus on, that God is there to help us. God will help us through His Word. God will help us through our prayers. And part of our prayers, I think, is saying things that we know is obvious, or, we don't do that a lot. But when we say a prayer in worship here, saying things that are obvious is not obvious to us. Again, I go back to the should we pray like the Pharisees, repeat stuff. And I think the Bible shows that we should. We should be focused on saying obvious things. We should be able to say them over and over as long as we're doing them for the right reason. We don't end up going off the path by just repeating ourselves. Anybody else see anything in that verse?
Well, something that stood out in my mind in verse number 8 is that thy righteousness lead thee, and thy righteousness we have a tendency, and I know I do it quite often, is that those are pretty good people, being around people who are in the world and they have, have good manners, they treat people like they have, by the world standards and by most standards, they are good people. But in this particular verse, he's talking about in thy righteousness. There's a difference between what we call good and what righteousness is. We have to be sure that we don't justify ourselves or evaluate ourselves based upon the goodness that we see as a standard within the world, but rather we raise our goodness up. Righteousness and understanding that God is in Christ place for us, and that's what we want to do is to seek after that as opposed to just being a good person in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And something I see in worldly people talking about God and how he's not good, obviously, because he doesn't take care of his people. He'll let a child die. In the church, their parents are trying to do the right thing. He'll let a child die, or he'll kill a whole city because of, he could have stopped the volcano. I was telling Rob about this. I was listening to a guy talk about why he knew there wasn't God, because in the 7th century, the most righteous city, the most God-following city, volcano, then they had an earthquake, and it destroyed almost everyone in the city. And using that as his example, well, God can't be righteous because that's not good. We wouldn't see that as good. Again, you go back to your righteousness is not God's righteousness, and your whatever is of man is of evil. I mean, that's hard to take in, I think. If you really understand it, you go, oh, whatever I make up as God's righteousness is not really God's righteousness. Natural law doesn't affect God's righteousness. That's what he set up. He established natural law. Rain falls on the just and the unjust. So I think we have to remember that. I think that's a great point too.
What you're saying about it seems like it's really repetitive and obvious that you think about all the things that we hear are the opposite. They talk about raising kids or training kids, they need repetition, and it becomes like their inner self-voice. So you have to think about we should be repeating those things that are good and to God to make that more of our voice and the thing that ourselves too.
This is something I didn't even think about, but think about all the negative things you hear every day.
Negative self-talk too, and so say the things that you want to be, instead of repeating yourself back. I'm the other side of the ship.
That's what I did. I did it just the other day. My mom's sitting in the car, and I said, "You're an idiot. Why'd you do that?"
Well, it's like I didn't know girls, so they say you shouldn't say I'm fast and all these things in front of your children. You have to become their voice too. So
this is a great point. It's really.
If you're saying you're in control, you're righteous, lead me. If you're saying those things, that becomes more of a over time as you grow.
So you have to do things that you are.
I was an idiot. I was just.
Yeah, you can't take away those things.
Yeah.
Hopefully, tell your things. This is what I should do. This is what I should be protecting. My things are smart.
thy righteousness, He will lead us, but we have to follow the instructions that He gives us.
Exactly.
We pray for leadership, that we disregard the Bible altogether, that we're not going to get to the point of what we want.
Which is really all of everything. It's everything about being a Christian. Because you can wish all you want, but if you don't do it, if you don't take the opportunities that are given, then it doesn't really matter what you ask for or hope for. But
I think mindset is your first place to start. You may not always get the bar, but you're constantly thinking of the negative once you what I should do.
yeah, I think it makes you not a very good person at minimum if you're always thinking about the negative, which is where I came from. I feel like I'm, always thinking about the negative. There was never positive. So if you,
It's hard to shift it.
oh yeah, even when you think you got it solved, you go right back to the same thing. You don't. It's not something you fix and it's just done. So I think your point is
world
really
sees
great.
us as Christians as well. We don't, they see us as trying to do right, or we're trying to do right. They see us as, you can't do this, you can't do that. They see all the hands and all the sad faces instead of we should be the happiest people on earth, right? Because we have hope. And, but that's not how we're perceived, because that's not how we're presenting ourselves.
Especially when you're negative all the time.
Right.
Like, if you walk around negative, everybody goes, well, I don't want to do that. I don't know what that is, but.
And I see so many people and so many so-called Christians that go just as close as they can to that edge, whether it's immodest dress or where they're going or who they're associating with.
Right.
But then
I think that's another good point. We're going to get down to another verse that I think points us at who do we spend our time with. David here asking, hey, help me to stay away from this stuff. It's all around me. It's everywhere.
Even as far as the good says, because of my enemies, we don't like to think of it, but anybody really that's not called what God says is our enemy. So
Yeah.
we kind of consider friends like him here. It's not really.
Exactly. That's one thing I have thought about, who's my enemy. A lot of times it feels like David's just saying, hey, can you kill this person? Can you kill this person? But he's really looking at, I think, who is God's enemy? Who's God's enemy? God's enemy is the unrighteous. And if you're spending your time with those people, you're like, I'm a Christian, I can deal with it. I like this person because they like to race cars like I do, or whatever your thing is. And you think, well, I don't have anybody in the church who loves to do this same thing, so I got to do it with somebody. This is personal. But you spend enough time with that person, or you spend enough time in a situation with someone, and you allow things to go on that you shouldn't be around, and it starts to affect you little by little. You don't even know it. You just start to react to the things that are happening. So let's look at the next verse. I appreciate all the comments. I think that was great. Next verse is verse 9. Here it says, for there is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. What do you think we can gain from this? Now he's talking about enemies of God.
Two New Testament passages in Scripture. One that Jesus said, you're either for me or against me. And he said, you either call the tree good or the tree evil. discussion is, well, doesn't the world in some form or fashion show the fruit of the Spirit, love, patience, long suffering to some degree? You know, and we say they're good people because they have a good heart, a loving heart, or they're kind and that sort of thing. But in this, it says there's no faithfulness. You know, there's no redeeming quality in them. How do we fit that together?
Yeah, again, what does man think of that person? Man thinks that person is a good person. I know a lot of people who are good people. Better people probably than people in the church I know. And they're kind people is what I mean. They're loving, caring people.
David's saying this by inspiration from the standpoint of how God looks at it. If you're not faithful to God, obedient to God, then there are no redeeming qualities that will put you in a position of goodness with God.
Exactly. So all those people that I know they're not following God, I know they didn't get that from the Word. They didn't decide to be that way because they wanted to follow God. And they're enemies of God. I'm like, oh my goodness. It's to a human mind sometimes it's like, man, what are we supposed to do?
It kind of pushes the thought on us that the intensity that we have to go into this, as far as, if we really want it, it's going to have to be at the top of our priority list to be on that faithful side, but there's not any playing around with it.
And all of us in the enemies of God. We're all in a lost condition without Jesus. So really that's all that separates those people from being not enemies any longer. Is that they don't have the blood.
Right. I think this goes back to something I said before, which is no matter how close you are to not being an enemy, that saying it in the negative, like, oh, that sounds better, you're not an enemy, but you're still an enemy. Doesn't matter how close you got.
And people want us to lay down. It's not black and white. There's all these shades of gray. And coming through the scripture, you realize it's really not. It's very black and white.
Right. Yeah, the thing that I was thinking when I read this is, how do we recognize? David's telling us how to recognize an enemy of God too. He's explaining some of the things you can account for. What are their words? He says it in several different ways. He says, no faithfulness in their mouth. Their throat is open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. He's like, listen to what they say. You'll find out who they are.
Think about what Jesus said to Peter. Jesus had told him, I'm going to the cross, I'm going to be sacrificed. And Peter said, not so, Lord. He said, get to the end. So if it's not the will of God, then it's, it is. And Peter was looking at it from the standpoint of his benefits, or, not even probably some of it as far as concern to Christ.
Yeah.
If it's not God's will, if it's not exactly like God expects it to be, then it's not. It's not.
Exactly. It's of man. It's evil, even though you think you're saying the right thing. A lot of times, I think people think they're saying the right thing too, and don't recognize that that's so against what God's thought process is, what God's righteousness is. If you don't understand God's righteousness, I think a good example was one of my employees, one of my managers, actually two of my managers, one manager working under the other. They were having a meeting about their performance, the lower manager's performance, and she's been under performance, documentation of her performance for a while, But she has this view that she's always right. So it doesn't matter what you say. She gets past it. Well, she went into this thing with the other manager about how God was going to punish her for what she said to her, for what she's done to her, and for all the things she's done in her life. And I thought, be careful judging somebody if you think you're doing the right thing. There's so many bad things about that. She thinks she's right according to the Bible. And she told this woman that she's going to go to hell and she's going to be punished on earth. She just went on and on about it. I thought, how dangerous a position you put yourself in, even if you feel like you did what was right in God's eyes. You put yourself in a really dangerous position by judging someone, especially when things aren't true, but she doesn't recognize that as not being true. But I think we all do that in some ways. We just recognize ourselves as right and everything else is wrong. So our righteousness becomes what we think God's righteousness is. We turn our righteousness because we've studied the Bible. We know what it says. So now I can judge you on God's righteousness. And when we're really using our own righteousness because we're upset about something we've done, haven't done. So let's look at verse 10 and see what we can gain from that. He starts out pretty serious here. Destroy thou them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee. Anything that we see about that, we can think about and use in our prayer, understand God a little more.
New Testament says pray for your enemies. Do good to them, persecute you. There's a little bit of a different slant as far as the New Testament is concerned. And I think on this particular passage right here, talking about destroying them, maybe in the context of destroying what they're standing for and what they're doing as opposed to killing them and casting
God
them.
says pronounce them guilty of God. So it's more about just, and it's saying it's God's job to do that too. It's not our job.
This goes right back to righteousness, right? What's God's righteousness? We should want the judgment of God in His righteousness. So, although this starts out like, I want you to do this, it sounds like, I want you to do this. But he ends this verse saying, for they have rebelled against thee. So, if David recognizes what God's righteousness is, and he is open to God's judgment being God's judgment, not his, then I think that's where he leaves it open to, anyone who is against you, they should be judged for their unrighteousness. And this goes, we've talked about this previously in just these couple of lessons about God's judgment is what we should want. And the reason we should want God's judgment is because without God's judgment, we don't make it to heaven. So you think you want God's judgment for the evil people, the people who did all the wrong things. But you want God's judgment because you don't go to heaven without God's judgment. Because God's judgment of what you have done according to His righteousness is what gets you into heaven. So I think that's important to recognize that David's probably not, to some extent he's saying destroy these people who I think you should destroy, but in the end he's saying those who rebel against you, against your word, against what you believe. Let's look at verse 11. It says, but let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee. What can we get out of this verse?
I think back to the point Lois was making. You know, we're the light of the truth. People see us with a scowl on our face all the time, and it's a big part of it.
Yeah, and it's one reason I think we need to fight so hard to be recognize what God wants. Because if we do, I think that joy comes automatically. It comes if we're following what the Bible says. The joy comes not maybe as easily recognizable in the beginning, because I think it's a task. It's not just okay, switch on, switch off, joy, no joy. It's something you work at. I've noticed it in my own life. How do you have joy? What makes you happy? Do these things that you do in the world make you happy? Because in the end, all those things you do in the world, they you're happy about it while you're doing it, or you're glad to be doing it with someone that you like, or you enjoy it. But in the end, when you go home at night, you're sitting there alone, or sitting there with someone, or you recognize that all that stuff didn't mean anything. And the joy that comes of recognizing that God is always there, God's always available, and that the joy that you can have through understanding, I think that's really important. Anything else anyone sees about verse 11?
Like 35% of my money or something. I believe that there's an ability for God or something that 75% of them or something feel empty and no purpose. So it's like a correlation of the ones that do and don't too. So you don't have that sense of purpose and what you're working towards.
Right. Yeah, you can't find joy in something that doesn't exist. Yeah, you try to find it in something and just doesn't exist on earth. So.
Richest and people that have the most are typically the most saddest.
The great part about the church is within it we get to live things, lay the treasures for heaven. I mean, that's what Jesus said. We're working towards something that will last forever.
Something I saw here I thought that was pretty interesting is first David said that those who trust in you let them rejoice. So he told them to do it first. He says, rejoice. And then let them ever shout with joy. So do it again. Be joyful. Be rejoicing. Do what you're supposed to do. If you rejoice in the fact that you understand the righteousness of God, if you act on it, then what it comes to, he says, because thou defendest them, let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee. These are all actions. So he's not just saying, just be happy. You're supposed to be joyful. You're supposed to be acting on what you know you're supposed to do. We have lots of things we should be doing as Christians. So if you act on those, then that makes you a joyful person. That makes you happy. So it's not just a matter of, hey, try to be happy about things, even though it's tough because it's a lot of rules, a lot of stuff you got to follow here. So I think for me, recognizing that doing something, all of the things that you could pray for whatever you want, but if you're not acting in the way you should, then you won't recognize a lot of times what your prayer is doing for you. You don't recognize the spiritual if you're praying for the physical all the time. Even if there's spiritual things happening based on your prayer, you won't recognize it because you can't see it. So I think you have to understand the Word, dig into the Word, figure it out. That way you can press forward in being a Christian.
Something comes to my mind in that perspective is talking about happiness and joy in that perspective. And I know they're different, but what's said here is that to rejoice is a commandment. When we look at happiness, we look at it from the standpoint, this makes me happier. It's an end result as opposed to the choice that I make up front. And he's saying here, and, the choice has to be made to be joyful and full. I mean, that's something that happens before anything else happens in our lives, when we do anything else, the choice to be joyful. And we can't pray and be joyful if we're in a bad relationship with God.
Yeah.
If we don't have that relationship, we can't have joy. That's kind of like what you're talking. People are so void inside, they can't have that joy because they don't, and they can't choose that joy or happiness because they don't have the substance of a relationship with God to even know about it.
Anything better than their
It's not a result of, but it's a choice that we make. We have to build off of that. Be happy that we have the opportunity to build off of it. Of course, what God has to be as far as righteous salvation, hope, and
It just made me think about that song we sing, Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Do it, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. That sometimes sounds like a silly campfire song, I think, some, but it's really, you're basically telling yourself, hey, this is something you do. Do it all the time. Do it over and over. All right, the last verse here in chapter 5 is, For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous, with favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield. Anybody recognizes there? Something we should be thinking about, praying for. Yeah, I think if we don't recognize what you're saying is, if we don't recognize that He is our shield, then He isn't our shield. If we don't ask Him to help defend us, defend our minds against letting things in that we shouldn't, defend us against our own thought process of what we think is right, what we think is wrong. I think that's good. What else do you see there in that verse? One thing I recognize there is he said, For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. So just recognizing that as long as I follow your word, as long as you guide me in your righteousness, then you'll bless me. So recognizing for myself that you'll bless me, not just recognizing that you're going to bless everybody, but I need to recognize, how do I get blessed? I get blessed by doing the righteous thing. And so I think that is, again, goes back to the shield and defending yourself. If you're following God in righteousness as well as you can, and you're letting God support that righteousness, then I think that He's your shield. He's your defense. He's your defense because you're doing the right thing. He's your defense because you're going to be joyful for it inside, and it's going to show on the outside. Anything else anybody saw there?
If you're being defended by God with this shield and you got the defense, you're not on your own. You got the help. The world don't have it. Only based on God's righteousness. It ties back into what you said of being defended with the shield, secure, and that's your only goal. Is journey to heaven.
Yeah, I think if you're really working hard and you really recognize what God's saying as righteousness, I think you end up feeling this protection. It's not just something, it resolves the question in your mind, what are we here for? What are we doing? What do I need to live for? The things that we were talking about kids these days. And not having any direction, it solves those things for you, especially if you're in the Word a lot. I think being in the Word makes it so much easier to defend yourself against the wrong thing. We're always being bombarded from every direction about what we should do or what people are doing that's not righteousness. So how do you defend yourself against that? I think you defend yourself by being in the Word. It makes it where it's possible for you to not be taken off track as much as you could be. Anything else that anybody sees in that verses 8 through 12 there? We're not going to get started on the next one here, I think. But we'll just go through that next week. One other thing I wanted to mention is when he starts this, and I know this isn't the beginning of the song, but he says, "Lead me, O Lord." And in verse 10 it says, "Destroy thou them, O God." And in verse 12 it says, "For thou, Lord." So when David talks about God, he doesn't talk about him like he's far away. Meaning, like, I'm not talking to you directly. I feel like sometimes in my own prayer life, I felt like I say, "Dear Heavenly Father," like it's far away from me. Something I don't understand or recognize is what God is. And I'm not saying that David recognizes all that God is, but recognizing God, talking to him directly, I think that's something that David does a lot. He says God, he says Lord, he says Father, all those things that maybe seem like, why do I need to say that? My King, why do you need to say that? I think there's value in pointing yourself. I think it's partially pointing yourself toward God. Don't lose focus of what this is about. Don't lose focus. This is about God. This isn't about me. This isn't about you. This isn't about what I need. This is about God. This is God we're talking to, and keeping yourself recognizing that you're talking about God.
I think that's part of the relationship. God uses things that we're familiar with. So he uses relationship. We can all relate to a child. We can all relate to the father-child relationship and so forth. I realize that fathers should be respected. He is the ruler of the house. But we should be able to feel comfort. Like, I'm going to talk to my dad. Like, you know him. You can speak to him differently than maybe you can a stranger on the street. And that's how we should know our Father in heaven as well, with respect, but with familiarity. He knows my thoughts, but I need to appeal to him.
Yes, that's what I think is the important point. We need to appeal to him even though, he's telling us everything we need to know in the Bible here, but appealing to him, that's what he wants you to do. He wants you to ask him. He wants you to talk to him and say what you need to say. So I think that's what I was trying to get across. I'm doing a great job. I appreciate that. Let's end with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you again thinking about your righteousness and how you can be our shield and our guide and protect us from our enemies and help us to recognize our enemies. Help us to recognize your enemies as unrighteous and recognize that we need to separate ourselves from that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.